I don't remember what woke me. There was no sharp sound, no sudden jolt, just a quiet shift in the air that pulled me out of sleep. It was the kind of stillness that feels wrong, as if the night itself is holding its breath. My room was steeped in that grainy darkness where edges blur and shapes flatten. The digital clock on my nightstand bled a dull red glow into the room. 3:03 a.m. Each number soft and slightly haloed like blood seen through mist. For a few long seconds, I stayed frozen listening. The house groaned the way old houses do, faint creaks along the walls, the distant hum of the refrigerator downstairs. But beneath that familiar hum was something else. A sound too deliberate to belong to the house. A faint, rhythmless shift of weight on tile. I slid out of bed without breathing. The carpet under my bare feet felt damp with the cool sweat of the night, every fiber clinging to my skin as if trying to hold me back. I moved toward the door, inching it open with a slow pressure so the hinges wouldn't squeal. The hallway beyond was a tunnel of soft black, the air colder than my room, carrying a faint metallic smell, like wet coins left in a warm pocket. At first, I thought maybe a window had been left open, maybe a raccoon or a stray cat had slipped inside. But the sound wasn't random. It was too careful. A soft scrape, a shift, silence, another scrape. I crept down the hallway, my heartbeat swelling until it filled the space behind my eyes. The house seemed to stretch longer than usual, the hallway pulling forward in slow motion. Each step pressed tiny groans out of the old wooden floor. I could taste my own breath, sharp and dry like paper. When I reached the top of the stairs, I stopped. Below me, the living room lay in shadows, broken only by a thin band of light spilling from the kitchen. A cold, almost bluish glow, the kind of light that doesn't belong at night, pooled across the hardwood floor. The sound came again, clearer now, the faint, deliberate shuffle of feet on linoleum. Something was down there. I leaned forward just enough to see. The kitchen stretched into view in pieces, the edge of the counter, the pale shine of the refrigerator door, the narrow window over the sink leaking a thin smear of moonlight. And there, in the center of the room, stood a figure. Tall, motionless, facing the far wall. It wasn't moving, not even a tremor. The posture was too rigid, arms hanging unnaturally straight at the sides. The head was tilted slightly forward, as if staring down at something invisible on the counter. There was no sound now, only the refrigerator's low hum, broken occasionally by the faint tick of the wall clock. But the figure didn't breathe. Or maybe it did, and I just couldn't hear it over the thundering pulse in my ears. My first thought was that it might be a neighbor, someone drunk or lost, but there was a heaviness to the shape that didn't feel human. The shoulders looked wrong, too squared, and the outline of the head seemed blurred, like a shadow in water. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the light, that my eyes were inventing shapes in the dark. But the longer I stared, the clearer it became. Someone was standing in my kitchen. I crouched low against the railing, afraid even my breath would give me away. A faint scent floated upward, something faintly sour and earthy, like damp soil mixed with rust. It made the back of my throat tighten. I wanted to run back to my room, to lock the door and hide until morning, but I couldn't move. The house felt pinned down, as if gravity itself had thickened. The figure shifted. Not a step, just a slow, deliberate tilt of the head, as though it had heard something. The angle was sharp, unnatural, like a marionette pulled by a string. Even from the stairs, I felt the weight of that motion, a quiet acknowledgement that I was not alone. I pressed my back against the wall, willing myself to melt into the wood. The air in the hallway felt damp and heavy now, every breath a slow drag through syrup. The refrigerator motor clicked off, plunging the house into a deeper silence. The clock ticked once, twice, then stopped. The sudden absence of sound was worse than noise, a vacuum that made the ringing in my ears painfully loud. From the corner of my eye, I saw movement again. The figure's arms rose, slowly with a soft tremor, as if testing the weight of the air. The hands hung at odd angles, fingers splayed slightly apart, catching the faint moonlight that leaked through the kitchen window. They were pale, almost gray. I could see no details, no veins or knuckles, just an unnatural flatness that made my skin crawl. I don't know how long I stayed there. Time stretched into something elastic, seconds pulling like taffy until they felt endless. My knees ached from crouching, but I didn't dare shift my weight. The figure remained still, arms now slightly raised, as if listening to something only it could hear. Then a sound, a soft click from the direction of the back door. The figure turned. The motion was slow, deliberate, a pivot of the entire body rather than a simple turn of the head. As it rotated, the edges of its outline seemed to smear against the kitchen walls, like smoke dragged across glass. There were no eyes, no face, just a blank oval of darkness where features should have been. Something deep in my body, older than thought, snapped awake. I bolted. My feet barely touched the stairs as I scrambled backward, my hands clawing at the banister. I didn't care about noise anymore. The house erupted with sound, the hollow thud of my steps, the sharp groan of the railing, the frantic pounding of my own heart. Behind me, I heard nothing. No chase, no movement, just silence. I slammed my bedroom door and threw the lock. My breathing came in sharp, ragged pulls. The room smelled of sweat and the faint iron tang of my own fear. I pressed my ear against the door, straining to hear anything beyond it. Nothing, only the slow, methodical tick of the clock resuming, as if the house had decided to start time again. Minutes passed, maybe hours. I never heard footsteps on the stairs. No doors opened or closed. Eventually, the first pale light of dawn began to seep through the edges of the curtains. I stayed there, sitting against the door, until the sunlight filled the room. When I finally gathered the courage to go downstairs, the kitchen was empty. The back door was locked. Nothing was disturbed, no footprints, no signs of forced entry, not even a shifted chair. Only the faint metallic smell lingered, like wet coins or blood, clinging to the air long after it should have faded. I told myself it was a nightmare, some half-waking hallucination brought on by insomnia. I repeated that story until it almost felt true, but even now nights feel different. At exactly 3 a.m., the house grows unnaturally still. The clock seems to tick slower, and every so often, when the refrigerator hums to life, I swear I can hear the faint scrape of feet on tile, waiting for me to come back down. End of story.
I always thought of my kitchen as the safest part of the house, the heart of the place. Warm, practical, comforting. It's where I brewed late-night coffee, where the hum of the refrigerator was a lullaby, where the faint scent of old wood and dish soap wrapped around me like a familiar blanket. On nights when sleep refused to come, I would sit at the small table by the window and listen to the quiet tick of the wall clock, letting the soft glow of the street lamp outside blur into a gentle haze across the glass. But the night I saw him, it, standing in the window, changed every sensation I had ever associated with that room. It was well past midnight when I wandered in, bare feet on cool tile, carrying the stale heaviness of a sleepless evening. The air felt unusually thick, as though the humidity had crept in from the autumn rain that had fallen earlier. I remember noticing how the floor seemed colder than usual, a damp chill rising up through the grout lines and seeping into my skin. The refrigerator hummed its low, mechanical drone, but underneath it there was something else. A faint vibration in the silence, a pressure in the air, subtle enough to doubt at first, like the distant rumble of a storm that hasn't yet arrived. I didn't turn on the lights right away. I liked the darkness, how the soft orange glow from the streetlight outside draped everything in long shadows. The sink gleamed faintly, dotted with tiny beads of water left from the dishes I had washed earlier. The wooden cabinets were barely visible, their edges blurred into the surrounding black. My breath created a faint fog on the cool window glass as I approached the counter. That's when I felt it, an almost imperceptible shift. The way the shadows seemed to tighten, to lean in. At first, I thought it was just the reflection of the street lamp across the road. A shape caught in the corner of my eye, subtle and unthreatening, the kind of thing you blame on fatigue. But as I leaned closer to the sink to peer outside, the shape didn't fade the way a trick of light should. It sharpened. There was a man standing just beyond the glass. His face was nothing but a silhouette, yet every detail of his posture was carved with unnatural clarity. Tall, thin, shoulders slightly hunched forward, as though he had been waiting there for a long time. His head tilted downward in a way that suggested he was looking directly at me despite the barrier of darkness. I couldn't make out his eyes, but I felt them, heavy, deliberate, cold. The faint light from the street lamp outlined the edges of his figure, catching on what looked like the folds of a coat that hung too loosely on his frame. The longer I stared, the more it seemed that the coat itself shifted ever so slightly as though breathing. I froze. My hands tightened against the countertop until the edge dug into my palms. There was no sound but the mechanical sigh of the refrigerator. The world beyond the glass remained eerily still. No footsteps on the damp pavement, no rustle of leaves, just him. My first instinct was to back away, but my body disobeyed. I stood anchored to the spot, chest rising and falling in slow, measured breaths. I remember thinking that if I moved, he would move. If I turned away, he would vanish only to appear somewhere else, closer, inside. The thought wrapped around my mind like a tightening coil. The only thing that made sense was to flood the room with light. A simple, human solution. Brightness. Exposure. Proof that the figure was just a trick of shadow and fatigue. My hand slid across the counter, fingers trembling as they searched for the switch. The plastic felt slick, almost wet beneath my fingertips. I hesitated, afraid of what might happen in the split second between darkness and light. When I finally flicked the switch, the room erupted into harsh fluorescence. The man was gone. Not faded, not blurred away like fog. Gone, as though the space he had occupied had never existed. The window reflected only my own pale face, wide-eyed and hollow, framed by the sterile glow of the overhead bulb. Outside, the yard lay silent and empty, the wet grass glinting faintly under the streetlight. No footprints, no movement, only the endless stretch of night pressing against the glass. A cold dampness clung to the inside of the window where his outline had been, a faint condensation shaped like a human presence. I touched the glass with the back of my hand, and it felt warmer than the surrounding pain, as if something alive had stood inches away only moments ago. My stomach twisted. The hum of the refrigerator grew louder, a mechanical growl filling the silence until it became unbearable. I stayed awake the rest of the night, every creak of the house sharpening into something sinister. The ticking of the clock was no longer comforting but relentless, each second a reminder of the empty darkness outside. My mind replayed the image of his figure over and over, analyzing the tilt of his head, the unnatural stillness of his body, the faint ripple in the shadowed folds of his coat. I tried to convince myself it was exhaustion, a hallucination born of sleeplessness. But the warmth on the glass, that subtle dampness, refused to be explained away. The following evening, I avoided the kitchen until the last possible moment. When hunger finally forced me in, I flicked on the light immediately, flooding the room before stepping across the threshold. The air smelled faintly of damp earth, though every window was shut tight. The condensation on the glass had dried, leaving only faint streaks that caught the fluorescent light in thin silver lines, like fingerprints dragged downward. Over the next week, I found myself checking the window every night. Sometimes I would leave the light on for hours, waiting for the hum of the refrigerator to mask the sound of my own heartbeat. Other times I would dare to turn the light off for a few seconds, just long enough to let the street lamp glow seep back into the room. Each time, the dark reflection of the yard stared back at me, still empty, but heavy with the sense that something waited just beyond the edges of sight. I began to notice small changes. The faint smell of wet leaves even on dry nights. The way the refrigerator's hum would falter for a single breath before resuming. The cold spot in front of the window that refused to warm no matter how high I set the thermostat. Sometimes, as I stood in the doorway, I thought I heard the slow drag of footsteps on the outside pavement. Not approaching, not retreating, just pacing. One night, near the end of that first restless month, I woke to the sound of a soft tap. Not a knock, more like the delicate tap of fingernails against glass. My bedroom is on the second floor, but the sound came from the kitchen. I lay frozen, staring into the dark ceiling, every muscle in my body tensed. The tap came again, a patient rhythm. One a pause too. I didn't go downstairs. I couldn't. I stayed in bed until the first pale light of morning seeped through the curtains, listening as the tapping faded into the hum of dawn. When I finally entered the kitchen, the window pane was streaked with fresh condensation, though the air outside was crisp and dry. In the center of the glass, just at eye level, was a faint smear, like the outline of a hand pressed lightly against the surface. I never saw the man again, but sometimes late at night, I catch myself staring into the reflection of that window, waiting for the faintest movement in the dark beyond. The kitchen no longer feels like the heart of the house. It feels like a threshold, a place where something once stood watching, waiting, and maybe still does, just beyond the reach of the light. The apartment was quiet when I stepped through the door that evening, but quiet wasn't unusual. My roommate worked odd hours, often slipping in and out without much notice. Sometimes I wouldn't see him for days, only subtle traces of his presence. The smell of his cologne clinging to the bathroom air, a dish left to dry in the rack, his jacket tossed carelessly over the back of the couch. That evening, though, the stillness felt heavier, the kind of silence that makes your ears buzz, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. I dropped my keys onto the counter, the metallic clink echoing unnaturally loud in the small entryway, and immediately noticed how cold the air felt. Not the kind of cold that slips in through drafty windows. This was different. It clung to my skin, almost damp, like the chill of a cellar. I kicked off my shoes and padded into the living room. Everything looked normal. The couch cushions slightly askew, the television remote on the coffee table, a faint smear of light from the street lamps outside bending through the blinds. Yet the unease stayed with me, crawling under my skin, refusing to let go. I told myself he was probably home, maybe napping in his room or sitting with headphones on, lost in whatever game or video he was absorbed in this week. The first sound came when I was setting down my bag. A faint shuffle, too deliberate to be the building creaking, too soft to belong to the upstairs neighbors. It came from the direction of the kitchen. My head turned instinctively, eyes straining toward the darkened hallway that opened into that space. The kitchen light was off. From where I stood, the space was swallowed in shadow, the faint amber glow of the streetlight reaching only far enough to catch the edge of the refrigerator. Beyond that blackness, I waited, frozen in place, my heartbeat quickening in my chest. Then I saw it, a movement, a shape, the unmistakable outline of a figure, standing just beyond the reach of the faint light. My first thought was relief. It had to be my roommate. Who else could it be? But the longer I stared, the less relief I felt, because the shadow wasn't still. It shifted, subtly, as if swaying on its feet. The head tilted too far to one side, then too far to the other, an unnatural pendulum motion that immediately tied my stomach into knots. I whispered my roommate's name under my breath, though no sound really came out, just the shape of it on my lips. He didn't answer. The figure didn't move forward. It just stood there, watching. I could feel the air thickening. That cold dampness grew sharper, digging into me like needles. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled as though charged with static. I took a single step closer to the hallway, trying to peer deeper into the dark, but the shadow retreated, smoothly, silently, disappearing back into the black like water pulling away from the shore. For a long time I couldn't bring myself to move. I just stood there, heart hammering against my ribs, telling myself over and over that it had to be him. Maybe he was playing some kind of stupid trick. Maybe I had scared him when I came in. That was possible, wasn't it? I forced my legs to move. Slowly, I crept toward the kitchen. My footsteps seemed absurdly loud against the hardwood floor, the creak of each board echoing through the still apartment. The closer I got, the colder the air felt, until it was almost difficult to breathe. My chest tightened, and there was a faint smell, something metallic, faintly sour, like wet iron. I reached the doorway and flicked on the light. The kitchen flooded with harsh yellow glow, washing away the shadows, revealing the linoleum floor, the empty counters, the spotless sink. Nothing. No figure. No roommate. But the air was still cold, and that faint, sour smell still lingered, caught at the back of my throat. I stood in the center of the kitchen, my eyes sweeping every corner. The refrigerator hummed softly, the only sound in the room. I opened the pantry, the cabinets, even tugged open the oven door as if expecting something, someone to be inside. Nothing. Empty. A tightness pressed against my temples as realization set in. My roommate wasn't home. The apartment was mine alone tonight. I knew it suddenly, with a clarity that left my stomach hollow. He always left a note if he was going to be gone overnight. And I remembered checking my phone earlier. He'd texted me hours ago, saying he was working late and wouldn't be back until tomorrow morning. So who had I seen? I backed out of the kitchen, flicking the light off again, as though erasing the evidence of my own fear. The living room felt suffocating now, every shadow a potential shape waiting to step forward. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands, scrolling to the last message from him. Yes, he was still at work. He wouldn't be home tonight. My body screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't. Not yet. Something in me needed to be sure. Needed to confirm that I hadn't lost my mind. I moved down the hallway toward the bedrooms, each step slower than the last. The carpet muffled my movement, but it didn't quiet the sound of my breathing, sharp and shallow in my own ears. I nudged his door open with my fingertips. Darkness. No one inside. My own room was the same. Empty. And yet, the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. My skin tingled, as though unseen eyes were fixed on me from some hidden vantage point. The air was still cold, unnaturally so, despite the heat running through the building. That was when I heard it again. The shuffle. From the kitchen. I turned slowly, dread rooting me to the spot. The hallway was dark, the living room dim except for the faint light through the blinds. The kitchen lay beyond, swallowed in blackness again. And there it was, the shape, standing once more at the threshold, darker than the surrounding dark, its head cocked at that same impossible angle, swaying side to side. I blinked, and it stepped back into nothingness. I don't remember how long I stood there, paralyzed. My phone slipped from my hand at some point, thudding dully against the carpet. I couldn't bring myself to move, not forward, not backward. Only my heart moved, hammering against my ribs like it was trying to escape. When I finally snapped out of it, I gathered my things and left. I didn't turn off the lights, didn't lock the door behind me. I just ran, out into the night air, gulping down the city's noise and warmth like it could erase what I'd seen. I didn't go back until morning. My roommate was sitting at the table when I returned, sipping coffee, casual as ever. The apartment looked exactly as it always did. The air was warm, the smell of coffee and toast filling the space. Normal. Ordinary. But even now I can't shake it. That swaying shadow. That smell of wet iron. That impossible silence. I don't know what I saw that night. I only know it wasn't my roommate. And I know it's still there. Some nights, when I walk in late and the apartment seems too quiet, I don't let myself look toward the kitchen. Because I know if I do, I'll see it again. It started with a smell, not the faint sweetness of bread or the warm, cozy aroma of a late-night snack. This was sharper, heavier, something oily and almost metallic, as though fat was sizzling in a pan that hadn't been washed in years. I caught it the moment I stepped out of my bedroom, a greasy warmth crawling down the hallway like invisible smoke. At first I thought it might be drifting in from a neighbor's unit. The building is old, and the walls carry every sound, every odor, every late-night habit. But this wasn't a distant smell. It was thick and immediate, curling into my nose with a clinging persistence that told me it was inside my apartment. Inside my kitchen. I froze at the top of the hallway. The air felt wrong, warmer than it should have been. My heater wasn't on, but a humid heaviness pressed against my face like the breath of someone standing too close. There was a faint crackle, soft but unmistakable. Grease popping. The sound of something frying. A low, steady hiss followed by the occasional sharp snap. It was the intimate language of a stovetop coming alive, the kind of sound that usually carries comfort. But tonight it was a sound out of place. Because I live alone, and I had not been cooking. The hallway stretched before me, a narrow tunnel lined with faded wallpaper and shadows that seemed to thicken with every step. The single bulb above flickered faintly, as if reacting to the heat wafting toward it. I could smell more now. Onions maybe, but bitter, burned around the edges. Something darker lurked beneath, like iron or damp earth, a smell that didn't belong in any recipe. My heart slowed and quickened all at once, each beat heavy enough to echo in my ears. I told myself it had to be nothing. Maybe I'd left the oven on, though I hadn't cooked in days. Maybe the wiring was acting up, the scent of hot metal mixing with my imagination. But the hiss from the kitchen came again, sharper now, like a deliberate reminder. I moved forward. Each step on the hardwood felt too loud, the floor groaning in complaint under my weight. I tried to breathe evenly, but the air tasted like old oil, slick and faintly rancid. My bare feet stuck slightly to the boards, a tacky drag that made me think of spilled syrup and unwashed hands. The hallway seemed longer than it had any right to be, as though the kitchen were pulling away from me while still beckoning. Shadows pooled in the corners like thick smoke, and I kept thinking I saw movement in them. A ripple, a shift, the suggestion of something waiting. As I neared the kitchen doorway, the glow of light spilled across the floor. It wasn't the clean yellow of my overhead fixture. This was softer, warmer, almost orange, like the flame of a gas burner turned low. The flicker of it made the edges of the hallway walls quiver, trembling as if the paint itself were sweating. The smell grew heavier, an almost tangible fog that coated the back of my throat with grease and salt. Beneath it lingered another odor, something faintly sweet and rotten, like fruit left to liquefy in the dark. I stopped just short of the doorway. From here, I could see the corner of my countertop, a sliver of the stove. A pale steam curled upward in lazy spirals, catching the light in a way that made it look almost solid. There was movement too, small, subtle, the kind of motion you catch in your peripheral vision and can never quite define. A shadow shifting across the far wall. Too slow to be smoke. Too deliberate to be a trick of the light. I didn't call out. My voice felt trapped somewhere behind my tongue, heavy and useless. Instead, I leaned forward, just enough to see past the frame of the doorway. The first thing I noticed was the pan. My skillet, black cast iron, the one I kept tucked in the cabinet, was sitting on the burner, its surface shimmering with a thin layer of bubbling oil. The flame beneath it burned low and steady, the faintest hiss breaking the silence like a quiet breath. Something sizzled in the center of the pan, but I couldn't tell what it was. A piece of meat, maybe, but pale and irregular, edges curling in ways that made my stomach turn. The rest of the kitchen was still. No open cabinets, no fallen utensils, nothing that explained who had turned on the stove. My door was locked. My windows were sealed. Yet the burner flickered with a patient steadiness, as if whoever had lit it was still standing just out of sight, waiting for the meal to finish. Then I heard it, not the hiss of oil or the faint tick of cooling metal. A sound softer, wetter, a quiet shift of weight against the tile. It came from the far corner of the room, just beyond the refrigerator where the light didn't reach. A scrape like bare feet sliding across linoleum, dragging slightly as though reluctant to move. My eyes darted to the shadowed space, but it was a black well of nothing, a pocket of darkness that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. The smell intensified, sharp and sweet, making my eyes water. The sound came again, a slow, deliberate step. Then another. Not toward me, but sideways, as if whoever, whatever, was in that corner was pacing along the edge of my vision. The flame on the stove guttered briefly, a small flick of blue, and orange that cast long, twitching shapes across the walls. For a fraction of a second, one of those shapes stretched higher than the rest, a tall silhouette that didn't match the outline of any object in my kitchen. The room seemed to breathe. A faint exhale stirred the steam rising from the pan, making it swirl into thin, grasping tendrils. I could almost hear the air move, slow, measured, like lungs filling somewhere in the dark. My skin prickled, every hair lifting as though charged with static. I wanted to back away, to retreat down the hallway, but the smell anchored me, thick and clinging, forcing me to taste it with every breath. The sound of footsteps stopped. Silence returned, heavier than before. The only movement came from the pan, where the sizzling slowed to a faint, uneven crackle. Then the flame beneath it flickered once, twice, and went out. The sudden absence of light made the shadows surge forward, swallowing the kitchen in an instant. For a heartbeat I saw nothing, only black shapes and the fading orange ghost of the burner. Then, from the corner of that darkness, a soft, wet sound broke the stillness. Not quite a breath, not quite a swallow, something in between, low and damp, like lips parting in a slow grin. I stepped back. The floorboard behind me creaked far louder than it should have, and the sound seemed to trigger something. A faint rustle stirred the air, and the shadow in the corner shifted, stretching higher, wider. My vision blurred at the edges, the dim hallway light behind me bending in strange, liquid ways. I thought I saw an arm, long, impossibly thin, slide against the wall, fingers trailing as though tasting the texture of the paint. The smell of burning fat sharpened suddenly, biting and metallic, making me gag. I ran. The hallway seemed to close around me, each step slowed by the sticky drag of the floor. My heart hammered against my ribs like a frantic fist. I didn't look back, not even when a faint hiss whispered behind me, like oil meeting water, like breath against the nape of my neck. I reached my bedroom, slammed the door, and pressed my back to it, waiting for the sound of pursuit. None came, only silence, heavy, thick, and endless. The smell lingered though, seeping under the door, coating my room in a greasy film of dread. I sat there until morning, knees pulled tight to my chest, eyes fixed on the dark seam beneath the door where a thin ribbon of shadow trembled like something alive. When daylight finally bled into the room, I found the kitchen exactly as I had left it hours before. The stove was cold. The pan was back in the cabinet. No trace of oil. No smell of burned meat. Only the faint impression of something having been there, a memory clinging to the air like invisible fingerprints. But that night, as I tried to sleep, a faint sound came from the kitchen once again. A soft hiss, a single crackle, and the unmistakable smell of something frying. I had always loved the quiet of my house at night. The old would seem to settle after dark, the air cooling just enough to make every creak and sigh feel like a natural exhalation. I lived alone, and the solitude never bothered me. If anything, it gave me a strange sense of control. Every door locked, every light switched off by my own hand. Nothing moved unless I willed it. That night began no differently, until it did. The evening had been damp, the kind of early spring humidity that carries the scent of wet soil through open windows. I remember the smell of rain clinging to my jacket as I hung it by the door. The kitchen floor still held faint footprints from my shoes, small crescents of moisture against the cool tiles. I noticed them because the tiles were always cold, even after a warm day. The house was old, its bones unwilling to hold heat for long. That chill had a way of climbing up through my socks, a silent reminder that the earth beneath me was darker and older than the walls around it. It was close to midnight when I decided to make tea. The hallway was almost black, a thin silver line of moonlight slipping across the floorboards from a cracked curtain in the living room. My own footsteps seemed too loud as I moved toward the kitchen. The air was still, no hum of the refrigerator, no distant traffic. Only the faint hiss of water pipes somewhere in the walls, like a breath being held. As I crossed the threshold, I froze. The moonlight from the back window laid a pale sheet across the kitchen, and in the center of that quiet, by the sink, stood a woman. She was facing the window, motionless. Her figure was perfectly still, as if someone had carved her from the very light itself. Her hair, if it was hair, hung long and straight, the color of bleached rope. Her dress clung to her in folds of white that looked damp, almost heavy, as though she had stepped in from a rainstorm I hadn't heard. The skin of her arms, bare from the elbow down, caught the moonlight with a dull sheen, not quite reflective but unnervingly smooth. I didn't breathe. My eyes adjusted in fragments. The smell of wet soil sharpened, richer now, mixed with something faintly metallic, like water left too long in old pipes. I could hear the clock on the wall, its tick strangely muffled, as if the air itself had thickened. At first I thought she might be a reflection, some trick of moonlight and shadow. But the sink was against the wall. There was no angle that could have mirrored a person. And she wasn't transparent. Her outline was solid, cutting the light with a sharpness that made my stomach tighten. I could almost feel the cold radiating from her direction, an invisible draft that lifted the hairs along my arms. I stood there for what felt like minutes, every second stretching wider, until I realized I could hear a sound beneath the ticking clock. A faint drip, water falling at an irregular rhythm. I had tightened the faucet hours ago, yet now each drop landed with a soft plink, amplified by the silence, as though the sink itself had become a well. The woman didn't move. Not a tilt of the head, not a shift of breath. The longer I looked, the more details surfaced, each one worse than the last. Her shoulders were slightly hunched, as if carrying a weight. Her fingers dangled near the edge of the counter, pale and narrow, their tips darker, as though the blood had settled there. Her hair, though straight, seemed to waver without breeze, strands lifting and falling in slow, unnatural ripples. I tried to swallow, but my throat closed against the motion. A thought crawled into my head, uninvited. If I turned on the light, she would vanish, or she would turn. I wasn't sure which outcome terrified me more. The air grew colder. My breath condensed faintly in the moonlight, a thin mist that floated and broke apart. A smell rose from the sink now, sharp and wet, like soil freshly overturned after rain. Beneath it was another scent, fainter, but unmistakable. Rust, old iron, blood diluted in water. I don't remember deciding to step back. My body acted before my mind. The floorboard behind me groaned with a long, aching creak. The sound was tiny, but it might as well have been a gunshot. The woman's head twitched. It wasn't a turn. It was a jerk, a fraction of movement, but it shattered the stillness like glass. Her neck tilted just enough that I could see the side of her face. The skin was gray-white, stretched thin over the suggestion of bone. Her cheek was smooth and featureless, as if something had erased the details with careful pressure. Where an ear should have been was only a faint indentation. A sudden pressure filled the room, as though the air thickened into water. My ears rang. The drip of the faucet quickened, each drop hitting the sink with frantic urgency. The clock ticked faster, then slower, then stopped altogether. My heart thudded so loudly I felt it in my teeth. She moved. Not a turn. Not a step. One moment she was by the sink, the next she was closer. Just a few inches, but enough that the light changed along her shoulders. I hadn't seen her move. She was simply nearer, as though the distance itself had folded. A cold dampness touched my face, a breath without origin. The smell of earth was overpowering now, layered with the sharp tang of metal. My vision blurred at the edges. Somewhere deep in the house a pipe groaned, low and hollow. I wanted to run, but my legs betrayed me. They trembled, useless. I could only stare as her hand began to rise. Slow, deliberate, fingers uncurling like something long dead remembering movement. Her nails were dark, not with polish, but with something thicker, something that absorbed the moonlight instead of reflecting it. The hand lifted until her palm hovered over the faucet handle. Without sound, she pressed it down. Water burst from the tap in a sudden hiss. The spray was wrong, too forceful, too cold. Droplets scattered across the counter, but none touched her. The water ran black for a heartbeat before clearing to a faint, cloudy gray. The noise broke whatever spell held me. I stumbled backward, nearly slipping on the cool tiles of the hallway. My shoulder struck the doorframe with a crack that echoed through the silent house. The woman did not react. Her head remained tilted toward the window, her hands still on the faucet. I fled. I don't remember reaching my bedroom. I don't remember closing the door. Only the sound of running water followed me, steady and relentless, like a heartbeat that wasn't mine. I sat against the wall until the first light of morning seeped through the curtains. Only then did I force myself to move. The house was silent again, the air dry and stale, as if nothing had happened. My body ached from tension as I crept back toward the kitchen. The room was empty. The sink was dry. The faucet was tight. No footprints marked the damp tiles. Only a faint scent of wet soil lingered, clinging to the air like a memory that refused to fade. For days afterward, I avoided the kitchen at night. The smell would return sometimes, soft at first, then sharp, like rain on iron. I would catch it in the hallway or drifting from the basement vents, a reminder that she might still be standing there, waiting for the moment the moonlight found her again. And even now, when the house settles after dark and the pipes sigh behind the walls, I hear it, the faint drip of water, patient and deliberate, as if someone pale and silent is still standing by the sink, waiting for me to come back. It started with a sound so small I almost convinced myself I hadn't heard it at all. A faint shift of air, the gentle groan of old wood beneath weight. My apartment was the kind of place that seemed to sigh with every temperature change, where pipes whispered and walls settled like tired lungs. But that night, long after midnight, the noise cut through the thick quiet in a way that felt deliberate, like the house wasn't merely shifting but reacting. I lay in bed for a moment, the glow of the digital clock bleeding red numbers into the darkness. 12:47 a.m. My stomach tightened with the hollow ache of hunger, the kind that sits just beneath the ribs and makes you restless. I told myself the noise was nothing more than my own body complaining. Maybe a glass of milk, maybe the cold slice of leftover pizza I'd been saving. Something to settle the gnawing emptiness. The floor was cold when my feet touched it, a thin layer of chill rising through the old wood. My apartment always smelled faintly of dust and detergent, but that night there was something else. A dampness, almost metallic, like rain-soaked concrete, even though the windows were sealed and the sky outside had been clear when I'd gone to bed. I tried to ignore it as I moved down the hallway, my steps soft but impossibly loud to my own ears. The living room stretched out like a cavern of shadow. Streetlight bled weakly through the blinds, slicing pale lines across the carpet and furniture. Each strip of light felt like a fragile lifeline, but the darkness between them was thick and waiting. I paused at the threshold, listening. The refrigerator hummed faintly from the kitchen, a low electric heartbeat. Nothing else. Still, I couldn't shake the sense that something in the room was aware of me. The kitchen door stood slightly ajar, a sliver of black more absolute than the rest of the dark. The light inside was off, but the faint hum of the refrigerator was louder here, like it had been turned up or had crept closer. The smell of cold metal met me first, sharp and almost wet, mixed with the faint sourness of old leftovers. My hunger felt distant now, replaced by a quiet unease that tightened the back of my neck. I pushed the door open with the slowest pressure of my fingertips. It swung with a sound that was more felt than heard, the hinges complaining in a low, drawn-out breath. The kitchen yawned open, a room I'd walked into 1,000 times suddenly foreign. The moonlight from the small window over the sink bled in a thin silver sheet across the linoleum, stopping just short of the refrigerator. That was when I saw him. At first he was nothing more than a darker shape within the dark, a silhouette too still to be a trick of the eyes. He stood against the far wall, not leaning, not shifting, just there. My brain tried to catalog details. The faint suggestion of shoulders, the uneven outline of hair, the faint gleam where eyes might have been. I thought I was looking at a shadow until my eyes adjusted enough to catch it. White. Teeth. He was smiling. The smile didn't move. It didn't twitch or widen or falter. It simply existed, stark and impossible, a bright curve of teeth suspended in the murk. He stood in a patch of darkness untouched by moonlight, but somehow the grin seemed to generate its own faint glow, like the white of bone in a deep cave. Every instinct in me screamed to move, to slam the door, to run back to the bedroom and lock myself in. But my body betrayed me. I remained in the doorway, heart pounding so hard it felt as though it might shake the walls. My breath came in shallow bursts, loud enough to seem obscene against the silence. The smell hit me next, something sour and human. Sweat and damp clothing, the faint coppery tang of iron. It slid through the air like a damp cloth, clinging to the back of my throat. The grin never wavered. He didn't blink. I could feel my own pulse in my fingertips, in the arches of my feet, a frantic rhythm against the frozen stillness of the room. I tried to tell myself it was a hallucination, a trick of light. Maybe the moon was catching something on the counter, maybe my own reflection in the glass of the cabinet. But the longer I stared, the more undeniable he became. I could see the slow rise and fall of his chest, the faint texture of fabric where his arms hung motionless at his sides. And then I heard it, a faint scrape against the floor, so soft it might have been nothing. But it was there, a careful, deliberate shifting of weight. He hadn't moved forward. He hadn't reached for me. He had simply adjusted, like a predator easing into a more comfortable stance before a lunge. The temperature seemed to drop. My breath came out in thin, shaky clouds I could almost see. I backed away without realizing it, my heel catching the edge of the rug in the living room. The sound, soft as it was, echoed like a gunshot in the silence. His head tilted, just slightly, enough for the dim light to catch the edges of his teeth. That was the first time I knew with certainty that he was aware of me. I turned and ran. The hallway felt endless, a narrow tunnel of shadow that stretched with each panicked step. I slammed my bedroom door and twisted the lock, the metallic click a brittle prayer. My heart hammered so violently I could feel it in my teeth. I pressed my back against the door, waiting for the sound of footsteps, waiting for the creak of the floorboards. Nothing. The silence on the other side of the door was worse than any noise could have been. I strained to hear something, breathing, movement, anything, but the apartment had returned to its old, indifferent quiet. The only sound was the thin electric whine of the refrigerator and the frantic blood rushing in my ears. Minutes bled into what felt like hours. My legs cramped, but I didn't dare move. Eventually, as the edges of exhaustion dulled my panic, I crawled onto the bed and sat upright against the wall, eyes locked on the door. I don't remember falling asleep. Morning light poured through the blinds when I finally stirred. The door remained closed. My throat ached with dryness, my muscles stiff from hours of tension. Slowly, cautiously, I unlocked the door and stepped into the hallway. The living room looked exactly as it always did. Dust motes floated in the soft sunlight. The air smelled faintly of coffee from the neighbors brewing next door. The kitchen door stood wide open. Inside, nothing was out of place. The refrigerator hummed with its usual lazy rhythm. The window over the sink glowed with pale morning light. The linoleum floor showed no footprints but mine. No sign of anyone standing in the corner, no faint outline of a grin. And yet, as I reached for the refrigerator, a single thing caught my eye. On the countertop, where I had left nothing the night before, sat a single wet handprint. Palm down, fingers splayed. The droplets glistened faintly in the sunlight before sinking into the surface, leaving behind the faint metallic scent of damp earth and iron. I never found out how he got in. I never found out if he left. Sometimes, late at night, when the hunger wakes me again, I stand at the edge of the hallway and listen to the silence. And in the deepest pockets of darkness, just beyond the reach of the moonlight, I swear I can feel the weight of eyes waiting for me to open that door. I never thought I would need a security camera inside my own home. The neighborhood was quiet, almost unnervingly so, with long stretches of stillness broken only by the occasional bark of a distant dog or the soft hum of a passing car. But there was something about the house itself that always left a faint residue of unease, like a cold film that never fully washed away no matter how bright the morning sunlight spilled across the walls. I had installed the camera weeks earlier after a string of restless nights. It wasn't fear of intruders, at least not at first. It was more of a subtle disquiet, small, almost imperceptible things that kept building. Cupboard doors left slightly ajar when I was certain they had been closed. The faint scrape of a chair leg across tile when I knew I had been alone all day. A lingering smell of damp earth in the kitchen at odd hours, a smell that clung to the back of my throat like wet leaves pressed into soil. The camera was small, nearly invisible from a distance. I mounted it high in the corner of the kitchen. A single black eye angled down toward the counters and the narrow strip of hallway leading to my bedroom. Its soft red indicator light barely glowed at night, but I found comfort in the thought that it was there, quietly watching when I couldn't. The first few nights passed without incident. I would wake up, scroll through the footage, and see nothing but the slow rhythm of my own life. The refrigerator humming, the shadows stretching and collapsing as the hours crawled past. Sometimes I'd catch a flicker of headlights spilling through the blinds, or the lazy drift of dust motes catching the infrared glow. Normal things, things that should have been enough to soothe me. But the unease didn't fade. It grew stronger. The nights began to feel heavier. I'd lie awake and listen to the house breathing around me, would settling in soft groans, the faint tick of pipes cooling in the walls. I'd hear a soft scuff against the linoleum and tell myself it was the refrigerator cycling. I'd smell that damp earth again, faint but distinct, as if the soil beneath the foundation had pushed its way up through the floor. On the fourth night, I slept harder than usual. A dense, dreamless sleep, the kind that feels like sinking into deep water. When I woke, the light outside was a pale gray, a sickly pre-dawn color that made everything look washed and brittle. My phone buzzed with the usual motion alerts from the camera. Normally I'd glance at them and swipe them away. That morning, my thumb hesitated over the screen. The first clip began like all the others. Midnight. The kitchen was a dull monochrome, counters reflecting the weak glow of the nightlight plugged into the far wall. For the first 20 seconds, nothing moved. Just the quiet thrum of the house, captured in grainy static. Then a flicker. Not a glitch. Not a shadow. A figure. It stepped into view from the far left corner, where the hallway met the kitchen. Tall and possibly thin. Its outline wavered like heat rising from asphalt. I couldn't see a face. The head was tilted slightly downward, but not enough to hide the sheer wrongness of its shape. Too narrow, almost stretched. It stood there, still, watching. I felt my chest tighten as I leaned closer to the screen. There was no sound in the clip, but in my mind I heard the house around it. The refrigerator clicking, the faint buzz of the light. The figure did not move. Seconds dragged into a full minute. It never shifted its weight, never swayed, never breathed. And then, in one abrupt flicker of the feed, it was gone. No retreat, no turn, just absence. I replayed the clip over and over, each time convincing myself I would catch some trace of movement. But the camera never blinked. The figure simply existed in one frame and vanished in the next, leaving only the sterile stillness of the empty kitchen. A cold sweat gathered at the base of my neck. I checked the front door footage, nothing. The windows, nothing. Every other camera remained undisturbed. Only the kitchen. Only that single moment. The logical part of my mind clawed for explanations. A trick of the infrared. A reflection from passing headlights. Compression artifacts. Anything to ground me back in reality. But the figure's silhouette lingered in my thoughts with a clarity that defied reason. I could almost feel its presence as I sat there, staring at the grainy image on my phone. The air around me began to change as the day crawled on. The kitchen felt colder, a damp chill that no amount of sunlight seemed to chase away. That earthy smell thickened, seeping through the cracks of the hallway and into my bedroom. A scent of overturned soil and something faintly metallic, like rust or dried blood. That night, sleep felt impossible. I lay in bed, every muscle tight, every breath shallow. The house was too quiet. The silence was not empty. It felt weighted, as if something occupied it fully. At 2:13 a.m., the motion alert buzzed again. I didn't want to look. My body screamed against it, but my hand moved on its own, dragging the screen awake. The kitchen appeared, bathed in the same grainy monochrome. Empty. And then movement. Not from the hallway this time. From directly beneath the camera. The figure rose slowly into view, as if it had been crouching just below the lens, waiting. Its head tilted upward until the face, or what should have been a face, met the camera. There were no features. No eyes. No mouth. Just a smooth, pale surface that seemed to ripple like water beneath a thin membrane. It stood there for what felt like an eternity. The camera caught the faintest tremor in its stance, a subtle tightening, as though it were straining to hold itself still. Then, with a sudden, violent lurch, the figure twisted its head toward the hallway, toward my bedroom. The feed cut to static. I don't remember moving. One moment I was staring at the screen, and the next I was standing in the dark, my heart hammering so hard it drowned out every other sound. The floor beneath my feet felt damp, almost spongy, as if water had seeped into the wood. I didn't open my door. I couldn't. I stood there for hours, paralyzed, every nerve screaming as the house around me exhaled in slow, deliberate creaks. When dawn finally bled through the blinds, I forced myself to check the kitchen. The air was heavy and wet, clinging to my skin like a second layer. The tiles were cold beneath my bare feet, colder than stone. Everything looked normal. The camera light blinked its steady red. But when I checked the footage later, the last recorded clip was the one with static. The camera hadn't captured a single frame after that moment. It remains frozen on my phone, a single corrupted file I can't bring myself to delete. I keep telling myself it was a malfunction, a trick of light, a dream bleeding into wakefulness. But some nights, when the house grows too quiet and the smell of damp earth rises faintly from the floor, I swear I can feel it again, standing just beyond the reach of the camera, watching, waiting for the next time I fall asleep. It was the kind of night where the silence of the house felt heavier than usual, as if the air itself was holding its breath. I lay awake in bed, staring at the faint glow of the streetlight leaking through my curtains. The clock on my nightstand ticked with a soft, deliberate rhythm, each second punctuating the emptiness around me. I wasn't particularly restless, just awake. That's when I heard it, a sound that didn't belong. It was subtle at first, a distant creak, a hinge settling, the faint thump of something shifting weight on the kitchen floor. My house is old, the kind of structure that groans when the temperature changes or when a breeze slips beneath the eaves. Normally, those noises barely register. But this sound had an unmistakable cadence, a human intention behind it. Then came the noise that pulled me upright, the refrigerator door opening. It was unmistakable, that hollow suction of the seal breaking, followed by the soft, rubbery pop as it swung free. A faint hum of cold air escaped, and I swear I felt it from across the hallway, a ghost of chill that crawled under the crack of my bedroom door. I froze, every muscle in my body locked as my mind scrambled for an explanation. I live alone. No one else had a key. No one else should be in that kitchen. The hum of the fridge changed slightly, the compressor adjusting to the sudden rush of warmer air. I heard the faint clink of glass against glass, something being shifted on a shelf. Slow, deliberate movements, not the frantic shuffle of a burglar searching for valuables. This was casual. Someone was simply looking inside my refrigerator. I slid my feet to the floor, careful to avoid the spots where the wood panels creaked. The air in the room felt colder than before, or maybe that was just the blood retreating from my skin. I crept toward the door, each step a careful negotiation with the ancient floorboards. My heartbeat was so loud I worried whoever, or whatever, was in the kitchen would hear it before I even reached the hallway. As I inched closer, the house revealed its own quiet details. The faint smell of detergent from the laundry I'd folded earlier. The dry, dusty scent of the carpet. And underneath it all, something else. A faint odor drifting from the kitchen. Not the sharp tang of spoiled food, nor the comforting aroma of leftovers. This was different. Metallic. Damp. Like wet stone after rain, mingled with something faintly sweet, like fruit that had been left to rot. I reached the edge of the hallway and pressed myself against the wall. From here, I could see the thin slice of kitchen illuminated by the refrigerator's interior light. It was a pale, almost bluish glow, sharp against the surrounding darkness. The fridge door was open, casting a rectangular beam across the tiled floor. Within that glow, a shape moved. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. A shadow that didn't belong, stretched unnaturally across the cabinets. Then the figure stepped back, just enough for me to see them clearly. It wasn't anyone I knew. They were standing directly in front of the open fridge, slightly hunched, their head tilted at a curious angle as they stared into the shelves. Their body was lean but strangely elongated, as if their limbs didn't quite match the proportions of a normal human frame. Their skin, at least what I could see of it, was a pale grayish tone, the kind that almost reflected the light like damp clay. They weren't touching anything. Their hands hung loosely at their sides, long fingers twitching every so slightly. The head tilted again, a slow, deliberate motion, as if listening for something beyond my understanding. The most unsettling part was their stillness. Aside from the faint twitch of their fingers and the occasional tilt of their head, they didn't move. They didn't even seem to breathe. The air around them felt charged, like the static before a lightning strike. I should have run. I should have locked myself in my room, called the police, done anything but stand there. But I couldn't move. My body felt like it had been poured full of wet cement. My eyes refused to look away. The figure slowly began to turn. Not all at once. Their head rotated first, inch by inch, until it faced the hallway where I stood. For a heartbeat, their eyes remained hidden in shadow. Then the light from the fridge caught them. They were wrong. Too large, too reflective. Like polished stones slick with water. No whites, no pupils, just two black surfaces that seemed to swallow the light around them. And then they smiled. It wasn't a human smile. The mouth stretched too far, pulling at the corners of the face until the skin around it wrinkled unnaturally. Teeth emerged, but they weren't sharp. They were perfectly flat, perfectly even, like rows of small, polished stones. The air in the hallway grew heavy, pressing against my chest. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator struggling to maintain its temperature, the compressor whining as the open door let out cold air. Somewhere in the distance, a pipe dripped rhythmically, each drop echoing like a metronome. The figure took a single step toward me. The sound of its foot against the tile was impossibly soft, like fabric brushing over glass. Another step, and another. Slow, measured. No attempt to hurry, no sense of urgency, just a calm, deliberate approach. I stumbled backward, finally breaking the paralysis that had gripped me. My heel caught on the edge of a rug, and I nearly fell. The hallway stretched before me like an endless tunnel. I turned and ran. The air in the house felt colder with each step, as if the figure's presence was draining the warmth from the walls. My breath came in sharp, ragged gasps. Behind me, I heard the soft, rhythmic steps continue. Not running, just following. I slammed my bedroom door and twisted the lock, though some deep instinct told me it wouldn't matter. I pressed my back against the door and listened. Silence. The hum of the refrigerator had stopped. The entire house felt dead. No creaks, no distant pipes, no settling of wood. Just an oppressive, suffocating silence that pressed against my eardrums until I could hear my own heartbeat pounding like a war drum. Minutes stretched into hours, or maybe it was only seconds. Time lost all meaning in that dark, airless room. Eventually, the cold began to seep through the door, crawling across the floor and wrapping around my ankles like damp fog. I don't remember falling asleep. I don't even remember lying down. One moment I was pressed against the door, and the next I was waking to the thin light of dawn leaking through my curtains. When I finally gathered the courage to open the door, the hallway was empty. The kitchen looked exactly as I'd left it, except for one small detail. The refrigerator door was slightly ajar, just enough to break the seal. A thin line of condensation had formed along the gasket, dripping slowly onto the floor. Inside, nothing was missing. Every item was exactly where I remembered placing it, except for one thing. On the middle shelf, perfectly centered, was a single glass of water. The glass wasn't mine. It was taller, thinner, the surface fogged with condensation as if it had been filled only moments ago. The water inside was perfectly still. I never touched it. For the rest of the day, I left the fridge unopened, afraid to disturb whatever had left it there. That night, I slept with every light on. And even now, weeks later, I can't stand the sound of a refrigerator door opening. Because every time I hear that soft, rubbery pop in my memory, I remember the way those eyes caught the light, and the way that impossible smile stretched just a little too wide. The house had a way of swallowing sound at night. It wasn't silence, not really. More like the air itself thickened and drank every noise before it could fully bloom. The refrigerator hummed low and steady. Pipes ticked inside the walls, faint but restless, as if they were alive beneath the plaster. Beyond the windows, the neighborhood stretched in a motionless sprawl of wet asphalt and leafless trees. Midnight in late autumn. A time when the world feels paused, as though something larger is holding its breath. I was sitting alone at the kitchen table, half-finished mug of lukewarm tea resting on the scarred wood. The chair beneath me felt colder than usual, the kind of chill that seeps upward through metal legs and hardwood floors. A draft lingered somewhere, faint but insistent, carrying a scent I couldn't name, something earthy and metallic, like damp soil mixed with rust. The overhead light flickered once, a lazy pulse of yellow that left afterimages in my eyes. I had turned it on to keep myself awake, but its glow only made the shadows seem heavier. They collected in the corners like pools of dark water. I traced my finger along the rim of the mug, listening to the small rasp it made against the ceramic. That sound, too, felt swallowed like everything else. The clock on the wall read 12:47 a.m. I wasn't sure why I was still awake. Maybe it was the restlessness that sometimes comes with long stretches of solitude. Maybe it was the creeping suspicion that the house had been listening to me all evening. Every creak of the floorboards upstairs, every sigh of the furnace, it all seemed to wait for my attention. I kept telling myself it was only the settling of an old structure, but the thought never fully rooted itself. That was when I heard it, a sound so small it might have been nothing, a gentle scrape of wood against tile. It came from the table, more precisely from the chair directly across from me. I froze, fingertips still resting on the mug. The sound had been subtle, a faint drag, as if the chair had shifted only an inch or two. I told myself I'd imagined it. Old houses move, furniture settles, yet the air around me thickened, and I felt the unmistakable sensation of displacement, like the room itself had taken a quiet breath. The chair was angled slightly toward me now. I was certain of it. I had left it pushed neatly against the table earlier, legs squared with the edges. Now it sat crooked, turned just enough to suggest invitation or arrival. The hum of the refrigerator seemed to grow louder. My own breathing joined it, uneven and sharp. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, maybe a vibration from the refrigerator compressor. Maybe I had nudged the table with my knee without noticing. But my legs were tucked tight beneath the chair, and the table hadn't budged. Another sound followed. Not the scrape this time, something softer, wetter. A slow exhale, carried across the room with the weight of damp earth. It was faint, almost imagined, but it curled around me like a thread of smoke. I felt it more than I heard it. A presence. I stared at the chair. It did not move again. The air seemed heavier on that side of the table, a density I could almost see. My eyes watered, straining against the low yellow light. I fought the urge to look behind me, to check the dark hallway that led to the rest of the house. My skin prickled in warning, the way it does when a storm is about to break. A single bead of condensation slid down the side of my mug. It fell in slow motion, hitting the table with a sound far too loud for a single drop of water. I flinched. The refrigerator hummed again, deeper this time, like a low growl vibrating through the floor. Then came the scrape. Louder. Longer. The chair across from me dragged back several inches, its wooden legs groaning across the tile. I saw it move. No mistake, no optical trick. The sound cut through the kitchen with a sharpness that made my teeth ache. I couldn't move. My eyes locked on the empty space between the chair and the table. The air in that gap felt wrong, thicker, darker, as though it were bending inward. I tasted metal on my tongue, the bitter tang of blood though I hadn't bitten anything. Something shifted in the corner of my vision. A figure. It stood directly behind the chair. At first it was nothing more than an outline, a distortion of shadow against shadow. But as my eyes adjusted, the shape hardened. Shoulders narrow but tall, arms hanging unnaturally long at its sides. Its head tilted slightly as if studying the room, or me, from a vantage I couldn't comprehend. No face. Not at first. Just a void where a face should have been. But the longer I stared, the more the void seemed to ripple, like water disturbed by an unseen hand. Features began to bloom faintly in the darkness, impressions of eyes set too far apart, a mouth stretched too thin. Not quite human, but close enough to strike a chord of ancient recognition. A predator's echo. The smell intensified. Damp earth. Rust. Something faintly sweet, like rotting fruit. My stomach clenched. The figure didn't move, but the chair crept back another inch, slow and deliberate, as if making room for something to sit. I wanted to scream, but the sound died in my throat. My body refused every command. Even blinking felt dangerous, like closing my eyes for a fraction of a second would grant it permission to come closer. The overhead light flickered again once, twice, then steadied into a dimmer glow. In that weakened illumination, I caught the faintest sheen along the figure's surface, skin that wasn't quite skin, as if it were wrapped in something damp and porous. A shadow wearing a body. The refrigerator's hum cut out abruptly. The silence that followed was absolute, not even the ticking of pipes. The entire house seemed to hold itself still. Then it breathed. The sound was soft, but it filled every corner of the room. A slow intake of air, long and deliberate, followed by a wet exhalation that carried the scent of decay. My ears rang with it, a pressure that crawled deep into the bones of my skull. I don't remember standing, but suddenly I was on my feet, heart hammering so violently I thought it might split my chest. The mug tipped over, spilling tea across the table in a spreading stain. The liquid reached the edge and dripped to the floor in a rhythm that felt almost intentional. The figure didn't react. It simply remained behind the chair, head tilted, body rigid. Waiting. I backed toward the hallway, every step an eternity. The tiles beneath my feet felt slick, though I couldn't tell if it was from the spilled tea or something else entirely. My peripheral vision pulsed with movement, shapes twitching in the corners, but I kept my eyes locked on the figure. When I reached the threshold of the hallway, the chair moved again. Not a drag this time. A sudden, violent jerk forward, like a predator lunging just enough to remind its prey of the distance closing between them. The legs screeched against the tile, a sound that carved itself into the soft tissue of my ears. I ran. The hallway stretched impossibly long, every step sinking into a floor that felt soft and unstable, like walking across a sponge soaked in something warm. I didn't dare look back, but I felt it, the weight of eyes or something worse following me. The house itself seemed to twist, doors and walls leaning inward as if listening. I locked myself in the bedroom and pressed my back against the door. The faint glow of the streetlight outside traced thin lines across the floor. I waited. Minutes passed, or hours. Time lost meaning in that dense silence. Eventually, the refrigerator hum returned, muffled by distance. Pipes ticked again inside the walls. The ordinary noises of the house resumed, as if nothing had happened. But I never heard the sound of the kitchen chair moving back into place. When morning finally bled through the blinds, I forced myself to open the door. The hallway looked exactly as it always had. The kitchen smelled faintly of stale tea and cold metal. The chair sat neatly tucked beneath the table, squared and proper, as though it had never moved at all. Only the floor betrayed anything. A thin, damp outline beneath the chair's legs. 4 dark stains in the exact shape of footprints, too large to be mine, pressed into the tile like something had stood there long enough to leave its mark. I haven't sat at that table since. It started with a sound so soft it barely registered, a dull creak that carried through the stillness of my small apartment. I had been half awake, floating in that strange in-between place where thoughts stretch and melt into one another. At first, I told myself it was nothing more than the building settling. Old wood, old pipes, the breathing of a structure that never truly sleeps. But then came the second sound. Not a creak, a faint, deliberate shuffle. The kind that belongs to a person trying very carefully not to be heard. My eyes opened to darkness thick enough to feel. The curtains over my bedroom window did little against the streetlight outside, leaving only a thin line of gray across the floor. My breath felt too loud. I lay there, frozen beneath the blankets, listening. The refrigerator hummed in the distance, a low, constant vibration that suddenly seemed to stretch across the entire apartment. Then another sound, closer now, a soft, dragging whisper against the linoleum of the kitchen floor. I told myself the obvious things. Maybe a neighbor, maybe a stray noise from outside, maybe my mind weaving patterns into silence. But the kitchen was inside, and my apartment is on the 3rd floor, the windows locked, the deadbolt slid firmly in place before I went to bed. I live alone. I always double-check. My habits are ritual, lock, slide, test the handle, test again. There is comfort in repetition. Yet the sound continued. A soft scrape, a shift of weight, a careful step. The air in my room felt suddenly heavy, like the atmosphere before a storm. I pushed back the blanket and placed my feet on the floor. The wood was cold enough to bite. My ears strained for any hint of movement. For a moment, nothing. Then, an almost imperceptible clink, the faintest contact of something metallic against ceramic. The sound of a spoon touching a cup or a ring grazing the edge of a counter. My kitchen. Someone was in my kitchen. The hallway stretched in front of me like a tunnel. I didn't turn on the light. Instead, I let the faint glow from the street bleed into the edges of the darkness. My breathing slowed to a shallow rhythm. Every board beneath my bare feet felt alive with the memory of past creaks, each one threatening to betray me. I took a step, then another. The air smelled faintly of dish soap and something else, something sharper, metallic, like wet coins. When I reached the corner, I stopped. From here, I could see a sliver of the kitchen through the doorway. At first, it was just shapes and shadow. The square of the refrigerator, the outline of the cabinets, the pale gleam of the sink under the moonlight slipping through the blinds. I leaned forward, heart hammering against my ribs. That's when I saw him. A man stood in front of the sink, perfectly still. His back was to me, shoulders squared, head tilted slightly down as if examining something invisible on the counter. He wore a dark jacket, the kind of heavy fabric that drinks in light, leaving only a silhouette. His hair was short, the edges uneven, like it had been cut hastily. I could see the faint rise and fall of his shoulders as he breathed. Slow, measured. I froze, unable to understand what I was seeing. There was no sound of an opening door, no shattered glass, and I knew that every entrance was locked from the inside. I checked them myself, twice. My brain scrambled for explanations. Maybe I left a door unlocked without realizing. Maybe this was a dream. But the cold air against my skin and the damp scent of my own fear told me I was awake. The man didn't move. He simply stood there, as if listening to something only he could hear. The refrigerator's hum filled the silence, a low mechanical heartbeat. I waited for him to shift, to turn, to acknowledge me. Nothing. His posture was unnatural, too rigid, like a photograph of a person rather than a person himself. My throat tightened with the need to breathe, but I dared not make a sound. A drop of water slid from the faucet and hit the sink with a sharp, metallic tick. The man's head twitched, just slightly, a tiny acknowledgement of the noise. Then he began to move. Slowly, impossibly slowly, he turned his head. Not the body, just the head, until I could see the profile of his face. The moonlight traced the sharp line of a cheekbone, the hollow curve of an eye socket. His skin looked pale, almost waxy, the color of candlelight filtered through smoke. I stepped back instinctively, my heel brushing against the wall. The faint scrape of my foot against wood was enough. His head snapped toward me with a suddenness that made the air seem to break. His eyes, if they were eyes, caught the light for a fraction of a second. They didn't reflect like normal eyes. They absorbed, black, depthless, as if the light fell inward and vanished. Every instinct screamed to run, but my body refused. I was a statue, heart beating in erratic bursts, each thud loud enough to betray me. He didn't step forward. He didn't speak. He simply stared, and in that stare was something worse than anger or malice. It was recognition, as if he had been waiting for me, as if he knew me. I forced myself to breathe. In, out. My hand slid along the wall until it found the edge of the hallway light switch. My fingers trembled. When I flicked it on, the bulb above me flared to life, flooding the hallway with harsh yellow light. The kitchen remained dim, the weak glow of the overhead fixture revealing nothing but the familiar clutter of my counters. The man was gone. For a heartbeat, I thought he might be crouched out of sight, hiding behind the island or pressed against the wall. I stepped forward, legs shaking, each movement slow and deliberate. The kitchen smelled faintly of damp earth, a scent that did not belong. The blinds were undisturbed. The door to the fire escape remained locked, the chain still in place. I checked the windows. Each latch sat exactly as I had left it. No cracks, no broken glass, no footprints on the linoleum except my own. I stood there for what felt like an hour, listening to the silence. Eventually, the refrigerator kicked on again with a low mechanical sigh. The sound was almost comforting in its banality. Almost. I moved through the apartment in a trance, testing every door, every window, every lock. All secure. No sign of forced entry. No trace of another presence. And yet the memory of him remained as real as the floor beneath my feet. Back in the kitchen, a single drop of water hung from the faucet. I hadn't used the sink since dinner, and I always dry it carefully to avoid the smell of standing water. I watched as the droplet trembled, swelled, and fell with a soft tick into the stainless steel basin. My stomach turned. The faint metallic scent lingered in the air, stronger now, as though something unseen had been here moments ago. Sleep never came. I sat in the corner of the living room until the sky outside bled from black to gray. The morning light should have brought relief, but it only exposed the small, unsettling details I hadn't noticed in the dark. A faint smear on the counter near the sink. Not dirt, Not water, a streak the color of old rust. The chair closest to the table slightly angled, as if someone had sat there and stood up carefully. It has been days since that night. The locks remain untouched. The windows remain sealed. Friends tell me I must have been dreaming, that exhaustion plays cruel tricks on the mind. I almost believe them until I step into the kitchen after sunset. That same metallic scent lingers beneath the fragrance of dish soap. And every so often, when the refrigerator hums and the lights flicker, I feel a pressure in the room. A weight, as if someone is still standing there, just beyond the edge of sight, waiting for me to forget the sound of a drop of water falling into an empty sink.